Okay, so for the sake of time, I'm going to go ahead and get started. As I mentioned, my name is Kelly Young. I work with the Justice Collaborative, and this is our first webinar in our Blueprint series. And to get some background, the Justice Collaborative's Blueprint for a Safer and More Just America is a comprehensive framework for national criminal justice reform and outlines concrete steps to address the country's mass incarceration crisis and provides actionable solutions to creating a fair and more equitable justice system. And one of the key principles outlined in the blueprint is to stop making poverty a crime. And on that topic today, our amazing panelists will discuss unfair fines and fees and how they function to criminalize poverty. Before I introduce them, I'd like to take the time to thank you, our justice volunteers, for all of your great work. It's incredible and has a huge impact. And just last night, two progressive candidates won the Commonwealth Attorney primaries in Virginia. And the research and media amplification projects that you all worked on ensured not only that criminal justice reform remained at the forefront of this election, but also that voters were well informed, which led to record voter turnout. So thank you. And toward that end, you will also hear from Molly Bernstein, our Associate Director for Volunteer Research and Advocacy, about how you can be more involved in our teams and bring the same recognition to the issues of fines and fees. Okay, so now on to our panelists. Joining us, we have Emily Galvin Amanza, Senior Legal Counsel with the Justice Collaborative, Jonathan Ben Menachem, Policy and Communications Associate with Fines and Fees Justice Center, and Ashley Gant, New York State Organizer at JLUSA. So thank you all for being here and your time. And as I start the discussion, if you have any questions, please feel free to write them in the comment box along with your name and where you're from, and we will do our best to get to them at the end of this. Okay, so to start us off, Emily is going to give us some legal context on the issue of fines and fees.
Sure. Fines and fees are horrible. That's the bottom line. We talk a lot about fines and fees when we're talking about the criminalization of poverty and economic justice. But what we mean when we say fines and fees, they're not actually the same thing. A fine is something that might be imposed in lieu of punishment, or sometimes in addition to another form of punishment. Basically, a fine is a consequence for a crime. So let's say you get a traffic ticket, you might get a fine in response to that. And that's considered a punishment. A fee, though, is a really different thing. A fee is not designed to be a punishment. Instead, it's a way for states, cities, counties, and other municipalities to force individuals who are involved in the system to subsidize the cost of their own involvement. So I know John's going to dig in a little bit to the different types of fines and fees, but an example might be you get arrested, you're thrown in jail. The judge sets an amount of bail that you would have to pay to get out. That's not a fine, that's not a fee. That's considered something you give the court to ensure your return to court. But let's say you bail out, so you've already paid bail money, and then you come back to court and you don't have the money to afford a lawyer, so the court appoints a lawyer to you. That lawyer represents you for several court dates, encourages you to take a plea in your case. That plea involves a certain amount of the drug diversion program through the court. At the time of your plea and at the time of sentencing, you might then be asked to pay a number of fees. And this could be on top of any fine that comes with your charge. So this might be a fee for the public defender's service, a fee for the court processing your case, a fee for the diversion program in which you were involved. If you're on probation, there might be fees for that. These are all mounting costs. There's often like victims' compensation fund fees and then sort of undescribed surcharges. These are all costs that are not designed to be punishment, but are often legally indistinguishable from them, because when people are paying money to the court after having been involved with the criminal legal system, it's really murky how their money is actually getting applied. Another key difference legally to think about is that oftentimes non-payment, for example in New York, non-payment of a fine can get you thrown in jail on a warrant for contempt or for some other non-payment consequence. Fees supposedly are not supposed to result in further punishment, but they often do. One, because a lot of states have rules that allow judges to throw people in jail for non-payment. or two, because people think they're paying down their fines when their money is actually being applied to fees. So that's just sort of a basic overview of how they are different. And I should note that both of them are different from what we call victim restitution. Victim restitution is a payment to a person who's involved in a criminal legal matter as a complainant. So let's say I break my neighbor's window with a rock because I can't stand him, and the court charges me the cost of the window in restitution. I'm paying back the damage that I did. That's generally what we mean when we talk about restitution, is some sort of economic compensation to the other party in the case. That's different from fines and fees, which are different from bail. So I will kick it over to John to give you some context on where this all comes from and the whole idea that you should be paying the cost of your own involvement in the system.
Hi, everyone. I want to give a little bit of historical context for the rise of fines and fees as a problem. So this is a pretty new phenomenon. Fines are older. They go back to colonial America, used as an alternative to incarceration as punishment, like Emily was saying. Fees are pretty new. So following the growth of mass incarceration in the 80s and 90s, governments and politicians were either not able or not willing to raise taxes to keep up with ballooning, expanding criminal justice system budgets. So fees were conceived as this way to make up those costs on the backs of the people who were being subjected to the system. So for example, in 2001, US cities were not generating almost any of their budget revenue from fines and fees. By 2006, 1.46% of their general revenue came from fines and fees, and in 2012, it was 2.24% on average across America. So in 2014, the shooting of Michael Brown by police in Ferguson, Missouri, attracted national attention to the problem, in addition to the Ferguson report by the Department of Justice, which talked in detail about how city government and police were working together to create quotas to raise revenue and harassing low-income communities of color and extracting revenue from them. But it's a problem in every state across America, and not just a Ferguson problem. Kick it back over to Emily for
So one of the dumbest things about the way this works, John mentioned that like cities, counties, and states aren't really collecting any money from these fees because they're burdening people who don't have the money to pay the fees in the first place. It's pretty ridiculous to both find that somebody is poor enough to need a public defender, but also has to pay the cost of their public defender. It makes no sense. And so states aren't generating a lot of revenue. But what they are doing is harming public safety. Two of the most important and kind of underutilized, I think, arguments against the use of criminal legal fees is that the fact that they can actually cause more crime and harm the ability of police to focus on crime that people actually care about. Like by and large, people care about violent, serious crime. They care a lot less about other people's traffic tickets. But in a study of over 1,000 Alabamans, people from Alabama, a study of over 1,000 people from Alabama demonstrated that not only are the people who are impacted by these fees foregoing food and medicine and other like really central necessities, and their families are going without food and medicine and other necessities as they struggle to pay down these debts, but these people can often be put in the position of having to commit new, more serious crime to try and pay off the fees from the less serious crime. About 20% of people surveyed in this amazing study said that they had actually committed more serious crimes while struggling to pay off low-level fee obligations. And I think when you first hear that, you may think to yourself, like, why would anybody do that? Like, just let the debt code, collections, whatever. But you have to think about how much a debt like this completely destroys your ability to live a functional life. You can't get an apartment with ruined credit. Sometimes it can be hard to get jobs with ruined credit. In many cases, and we'll talk more about this, but you can't get off probation or get your record cleared or regain your right to vote until you've paid all of these fees. So it's urgent. It is absolutely urgent that people be able to make these payments, and so many have been pushed into committing new crime to do so. Worse, in jurisdictions where the police are tasked with being the debt collectors for the state, and police are sent out to arrest people who haven't paid, the police don't have the capacity to focus on the crime people actually care about. There's this amazing study that showed that for every 1% increase in fines and fees revenue, so when the state gets 1% more money from fines and fees, they get 6.1% fewer violent crimes solved. So literally you get 1% of money and like 6% drop in your ability to address the crime that's actually harming people. This is mostly in small cities where police aren't super specialized, right? Like cities where in the police department, all the police kind of work on all of the crime. You see this effect less in cities with very specialized units, but in most cities, what that means is when you make the cops into debt collectors, they can't protect you from violent crime.
All right, I'm going to talk a bit about the different kinds of fees that are charged at different points in the process. And before I do, I want to mention another study just for general context on how burdensome fines and fees can be. The Ella Baker Center did a multi-state study with I think a few thousand survey respondents, and what they found is the average court debt, so fines, fees, and restitution, for an individual would be $13,000. And that's average, which means that some people owed $20,000, $30,000, $40,000. So with that in mind, I'll go through some of the different fees that are charged. And another piece of context about fees, like Emily was saying, fees are not meant to be punitive. Fees are taxes to fund the court system or government more generally. So in some instances, a fee will go directly to the prosecutor's office that is assessing the fee, or the court that is where the judge is assessing the fee. In more commonly, I would say the fee goes into general revenue for the city, county, or state, or some mix of all of those. In California, there are a bunch of state fees that apply to criminal convictions, and the revenue from those fees is split into a bunch of different categories. So a percentage of all criminal fees in California goes to the Fish and Wildlife Fund. In New Jersey, a percentage of all fees goes to autism research. And it's really hard to tell why people who are charged with crimes should have to fund those systems or those worthwhile projects more than other citizens. So I'll talk a bit about the different areas of the justice system where fees can be incurred. So from the very beginning of the process, there are pretrial fees. So if you're under criminal justice supervision, if you have an ankle monitor before trial, you can be charged a fee for that. There can be bail payment fees. Again, bail is separate from fines and fees, but the court can sometimes keep a percentage of it. There are sometimes fees for being detained pre-trial. You can have to pay for staying in jail. There are also attorney's fees. The Constitution guarantees your right to counsel, but it apparently does not guarantee your right to free counsel. There are supervision fees, such as probation and parole. Again, electronic monitoring fees apply in those situations, as well as drug testing fees. When you're incarcerated, there's a whole bunch of different fees that can apply to you for jail phone call fees, fees to send emails, fees to transfer money to commissary. And in some jurisdictions, like in New York State, if you get a disciplinary ticket for something you did while you were incarcerated, they can garnish it right out of your commissary. And then if you don't pay fees, there are a bunch of different penalties that can apply. Even though it's in most cases unconstitutional, you can be incarcerated in many jurisdictions for failure to pay a fine or fee. As Emily said, usually fines, but sometimes fees. Your driver's license can be suspended. Depends on the state. Something like 40 states suspend driver's licenses for unpaid fines and fees. And it depends, like in New York, you can only have your license suspended for an unpaid fine, but in a lot of states, fees too. You can be assessed additional fines and fees for non-payment. And in a lot of states, if you don't pay, the fine or fee will be turned into a civil judgment, which stays in your credit report and can make it harder to secure housing.
So I want to just highlight a couple of things about what John just said. First of all, when we talk about disciplinary tickets, I just wanted to jump on that really quickly because sometimes people think that sounds like really bad, like new crimes being committed behind bars. And I've literally had clients ticketed for shortening a pair of pants into shorts during summer, or for having like the wrong number of socks. I mean, you can get disciplinary tickets for literally looking in the wrong direction. So this is literally fees being assessed at every turn, around every corner, just for breathing. And the other thing I wanted to highlight is that we're going to talk in a minute about the endless cycle of license suspension. When your license is suspended, but you have to drive for work, so you get busted for driving on a suspended license, and then you get more fines and more fees, and your license stays suspended. I wanted to just highlight those and kick it back to John for who fines are imposed on.
Right. So generally, it's helpful to think of fines a little bit differently from fees. In my organization, the Fines and Fees Justice Center, we think all criminal justice fees should be abolished. And for fines, it's a little bit more like think about when we're imposing them and on who they're being imposed. So disproportionate policing in low-income communities of color means that people of color are more likely to be fined in many jurisdictions. And generally, I think it's useful to think about what behaviors are being criminalized. Like for instance, when marijuana is legalized, or it is sometimes only decriminalized, which means that you can still be ticketed for possession. And a lot of the time, fines can be issued for all sorts of quality of life offenses, like that apply to homeless people in particular, like sleeping or urinating in public. And when fines are imposed, a lot of jurisdictions don't consider ability to pay. So a homeless person and Bill Gates would receive the same ticket for the same offense, which doesn't seem to make a lot of sense. I think here we'll kick it to Emily again.
We have a volunteer question. Am I the one who brings up the volunteer questions that I know about, or does somebody more official than me ask these questions?
No, if it goes into what you're talking about, you can bring it up.
We've got a question about if will I get arrested if I've got a warrant? Generally, I should say criminal law is different in every state across the country, and I'm only licensed in 3 of those jurisdictions. So what I say is not legal advice, it's just a lawyer's take on the question that is a very general question. But generally what a warrant means is a warrant for an action, right? And often that action is a warrant to arrest someone. So if there is a warrant out for your arrest, generally that means the police do have a judge's go-ahead to arrest you. And yes, people can get warrants for fines and fees and for unpaid criminal debt obligations. What's really messed up, I should say, in response to that question, is how much that varies based on what judge is involved in a case, right? So I was talking with the chief public defender of Johnson County, Iowa, a couple of days ago, and he told me that there was literally a judge in the county who would, he said, once a week, this is literally his words, he said once a week they'd round up all the black and brown people who owed money, and they would arrest them and put them in jail. And that's just an example. When we talk about a warrant and a judge issuing a warrant, I think sometimes it can sound really like legal and official. And what we're actually talking about is one person who may well be a horrible bigot, giving the police clearance to round people up and penalize them further. So if you've got a warrant out for your arrest, generally it does mean that the police can arrest you. I'm going to touch really, really briefly on constitutional challenges to the ways that criminal legal debt criminalizes poverty. One, you may have heard the phrase debtor's prison. And there's actually, if anybody wants to Google this on their own, it's a super interesting history of how the US came to be a nation that does not allow what we call debtor's prison. Supposedly, in this country, very much intentionally by the founding fathers, you cannot incarcerate people because they owe money. But as we all know from 20 minutes of this, this webinar, people totally get incarcerated because of unpaid money all the time. And that contravenes the founders' intent to disallow the use of debtors' prisons, which were really, really prevalent in England. So challenges that arise to the way fines and fees are dealt with in the criminal legal system are often challenges to say, hey, this system is creating a de facto debtor's prison, where you, the prosecutor, are saying, I'm incarcerating this person because they are willfully violating a court order. The truth is, you're prosecuting this person because they didn't pay a bill, and that creates a debtor's prison. But there's also another argument that gets used to fight against the way criminal legal fees are used. And that argument is the Equal Protection Clause, basically saying what John just said. When Bill Gates and one of my clients, as a former public defender, get arrested for the same ticket and they get the same charge. That charge is literally 2 seconds of time of Bill Gates's money, probably less. I think Bill Gates makes like millions of dollars per minute or something. But to Bill Gates, it's literally not noticeable. It is an amoeba amount of money. But to one of my clients, it may be a life-altering amount of money. And that treats the entire category of indigent people differently and does not offer them the equal protection of the law. It's a really interesting argument because, and I won't go too far into the legal weeds of it, but it's a new interpretation of what is a protected category of person and who the Equal Protection Clause protects. And if you all want to read more on that, there's a lot on the Fines and Fees Justice Center website, finesandfeesjusticecenter.org. And I'm sure we also have some materials from TJC that we can send out in our backgrounder. John, do you want to talk about legislative challenges?
Yep. So we had a volunteer question asking if there are some states that have implemented effective legislation. I'll say broadly, California seems kind of like the utopia right now. The window of possibility seems pretty different there. They currently have a pending bill that would just get rid of all criminal legal fees that the state imposes. Last year, San Francisco abolished pretty much every criminal justice system fee. One that was left over was abolished just today, which is jail phone call fees. So again, counties and states, if they can find the budget money to make it up, they can just do it as soon as there's political willpower. But outside of California, it is a little bit more piecemeal. So I know this year Texas, their criminal justice reform legislative session was not very good, but fines and fees reform did get sort of far. They passed some protections for indigent defendants or defendants who can't pay for a lawyer. The area that's moving the most that we work on pretty specifically is driver's license suspension. Montana, Mississippi, Virginia, DC, and Maine all recently passed driver's license suspension reform to end license suspension for non-payment with varying levels of effectiveness. Like in Virginia, they just passed a budget amendment. So in a year, that provision expires and they're back where they started if they don't approve it again. I'll also say here that even if a bill is passed that we think is good, that it constitutes reform, sometimes you have to sort of set up a ground game to make sure that the change is happening in courts. Like in Rhode Island, there's 2008 legislation that requires ability to pay determinations before you can impose a consequence on someone for not paying a fine. But we know that judges have just been ignoring it for a decade. So in those situations, you need also, I think, organizing to support legislative reforms.
Can I throw in a plug for what's happening in Delaware right now? It's actually really cool and really new. It was, I think, last Friday, the Delaware Center for Justice filed a new bill. There's a lot of criminal, legal reform action happening in Delaware. There's 19 reform bills currently pending before the state legislature, but they just brought a new one specifically on fines and fees, which it's modeled on California's SB 144, which is the awesome California legislation John was talking about. So Delaware could be a state that gets hot in 5 minutes. And we're really hoping that that bill gains some momentum. So let's kick it over to Ashley, who's going to lead us in a discussion talking a little bit more about the actual real life impact of fines and fees.
Hi, can you guys hear me? Okay, sorry, I'm at Starbucks. I came outside thinking it'll be quieter. But yeah, I'm just here to talk about, I guess, personal experiences with fines and fees and what it looks like with everyday people here where I live and the work that I do. So I'm a criminal justice reform organizer with Just Leadership USA, but I'm also a directly impacted person when we talk about fines and fees. To make a long story kind of short, when I was 18, I got arrested. Not arrested. Well, I got pulled over and I got 2 tickets. One for, it was not stopping completely at a stop sign, and the other one was the muffler on my best friend's car was too loud. I got 2 tickets for that, and at the time, both of those tickets together may have equaled $300 or $400. And for some people that might not seem like a lot, but for me that was a lot, and I couldn't pay it. I couldn't afford to pay it. I wasn't too worried about it then. One, I was 18. And then 2, I didn't have a car. So there was no, you know, I didn't have it. So there was like no urgency to make it happen. I'm like, well, I don't have a car anyways. Fast forward to a couple of years later, I was driving again. This time I got pulled over. I don't think it was speeding. I can't remember exactly what the ticket was for, but I got pulled over and I found out that my license was suspended because I hadn't paid those tickets before, which got me another ticket. So I got like 2 more tickets after that. I'm sorry about the motorcycle. I got 2 more tickets after that. And again, at this point, the fines and fees on top of the first 2 tickets I got, plus the other 2 tickets I got, again, I couldn't pay them. So I'm not gonna say I wasn't worried about it, but I just knew I couldn't pay it. So, you know, I took the bus everywhere I went. It wasn't a big deal. When I was 24, I got pregnant with my daughter, and by the time she became school age, I needed to drive because she went to city schools, and we wanted her in a kind of better school district. I hate to say that out loud, but we wanted her in a different school district, and her dad lived out in the suburbs. So what would end up happening by this time, when I had my daughter and she was going to school, I actually went to pay off the ticket to get a car, but the tickets were $1,800. I still was working a minimum wage job, which was not a livable wage at all. So my daughter would stay with her father during the week, and every Wednesday, I would take off work, take the bus over 5 miles to the nearest mall to her school, walk to her school, then we would walk back to the mall to spend time together, go to the bookstore, do homework, and then wait for the next bus. That got overwhelming, and it seemed like the ticket amount was overwhelming. I couldn't even make enough to pay my bills, more or less pay $1,800. Lucky for me, though, I was able to borrow the $1,800 from one of my friends and end up paying the ticket off. But that is not a lot of people's story, and my story is not unique. I'm one out of hundreds of thousands of people. In between that time, though, I got caught driving without a license again, and because my license was suspended, and I ended up spending 15 days in jail because I was driving without a license. I live in one of the worst cities for public transportation. 20,000 of the students who live in our city, in our community, are living under the poverty line. So I would have to wake up 3 hours early and get to work 2 hours early just to ensure that I got to work on time. So anyways, back to paying off the tickets, I was able to borrow the money from one of my friends to pay off that ticket. But again, so many people don't have that option at all. And whether the ticket is $1,800 or $800, if they don't have it, they just don't have it. I just talked to a young man the other day. He's an economist, so he drove his bike. He rode his bike everywhere. A couple of years ago, he got a ticket for riding his bike without a bell on it. But because he's like, eco-friendly, he didn't own a car. So he thought, oh, it's a ticket for, riding my bike without a bell on it. No big deal. He just recently went to get a car, and that $75 ticket turned into a $500 ticket because of fines and fees. And he couldn't get a car because he had gotten a ticket a couple of years before for driving without a bell on his bicycle. Again, these stories are not unique. These are stories of people, hundreds of thousands of people where I live every single day. I do a lot of court watching for my job. So not only are we seeing people who can't pay tickets, we're seeing people who are going to prison for driving without a license. Literally, they're going and maybe their tickets are $1,500 that they can't afford to pay, but to house them in prison is $66,000 a year in New York State. And what we're saying is we'd rather pay $66,000 a year than come up with maybe a payment plan so that you can pay on these tickets. And it's person after person. Any given day in Monroe County and Rochester, you can sit in court if somebody's going to jail for driving without a license. I know of a man, he was 70 years old on dialysis. His license was suspended for not being able to pay his tickets. His grandson called him from a party because he was drunk and didn't want to drive. The grandfather took an Uber to the party and then drove the car home, got pulled over and got arrested and sent to state prison for driving with his license suspended. And he was 70 years old and here in Monroe County, sent to state prison. And again, I feel like a broken recorder because I say this is not unique. It happens all the time. But it happens all the time. I'm really grateful that people are noticing it and building some real grassroots power to move the work along to address this stuff.
Thank you for
I think
sharing.
that was it for me, unless someone has questions or anything.
We're going to do questions at the end. Thanks for sharing your experience with this. I wanted to add in very briefly before we move to the next point that we actually got some numbers recently on how common criminal charges for driving on a suspended license are in New York City. It's the fourth most common offense charged in New York City. And in New York, the city, 75% of drivers are white, but 87% of those charged with driving on a suspended license are non-white. So just to give you an idea of who this is impacting.
And just to give you like the on the ground view, I mean, I handled over 1,000 cases during my time in the Bronx, and every arraignment shift, we would see case after case after case that was driving on a suspended license. And unlike almost every other charge that would come through my hands, it was one that prosecutors would never dismiss. The best they would ever do is a fine and a fee. So even when they drop the charge down to an infraction, they charge people a $75 fine. No, $75 fine and an $88 court surcharge every single time, and that was the best possible outcome. So just to add in a little extra sprinkle of, even in one of the best jurisdictions to try a case in New York City, Black and brown people are being drastically burdened more with fines and fees on this particular charge and on most, if not all, charges.
We just did a survey here in Monroe County in the city of Rochester, where we asked people to come forward anonymously to tell us how many times their license had been suspended and if it had been suspended. I want to say we had about 250 people answer the survey, and out of the 250 people, more than 200 of those people license had been suspended before, and more than 160 of those people license has been suspended more than twice. Almost all of those people, maybe except for 5, were people of color who lived in over-policed communities. So it's just, yeah.
So I think we wanted to shift a little bit to talking for the last few minutes about what work is being done on the issue right now. And it is such an awesomely rich question, because I feel like this is kind of a fantastic moment in which to talk about this topic. And it's a moment in which the realities of the criminalization of poverty and of the sort of economic nature of the justice system or the legal system are really being recognized. For our part here at TJC, this links back to work we're doing with what's called the blueprint. So a lot of times when people talk about criminal legal reform, they talk about little bits and pieces of it. They talk about ending mandatory minimums, which is great, or they talk about closing private prisons, which is fine. But it's not every day that people talk about the whole animal, right? Like if we were going to reform the entire criminal legal infrastructure of this country, what would the whole animal look like? So the Justice Collaborative has put together what we hope is most of the whole animal. The whole animal is probably a pretty big thing, but it's 7 principles and 41 planks that are the key to what we see as necessary, urgent, and dramatic reform of the criminal legal system. And what we're doing with the blueprint is we're spending the next period of time going through that outline, which is available online. You can take a look at it yourself. You could read through the principles and the planks and give them to your friends and promote them online. But what we're doing right now is kind of breaking it down plank by plank and focusing a little bit on each discrete plank and on each discrete topic and pushing and seeing how we can lend our efforts to those who are already pushing for reform. So with regard to the economic justice plank, the fines and fees issue, right now we are working with partners in a number of different jurisdictions across the country to try and raise awareness. We are participating in some media that's happening in Delaware right now and ideally in a few other states. We've also been promoting the efforts of people on the ground with regard to SB 144, and Kate Chatfield, who should be on this panel, has been working enormously hard to advance SB 144 in California. But essentially what we're doing right now is trying to build a network of allies across the country who may be interested in partnering with us to bring about reform, ideally people who are able to exert some measure of influence on some part of the system. You know, who are the people who, if they decide to make one change in their own practice or in their own work life, can have a magnified cascading effect on the rest of the system? we'd like to work with those people, and we'd like to change their minds and get them to adopt more of the progressive policies that we've put forth in the blueprint. So if any of you volunteers know some criminal justice influencers, call me. I'm reaching out to many myself and working with partners on the ground to advance issues, especially fines and fees right now in this moment.
Very brief elevator pitch on what Fines and Fees Justice Center does. We have three main mission statement goals. The first thing we do is we are a human who will answer the phone when people want to learn more about fines and fees, the movement to reform it, and help other people who are working on the issue. Although, we don't really have, there was a volunteer question about where people can direct their energy. We don't have like a volunteer program right now, just wanted to say that. But generally, we act as like a resource center support hub for people working on fines and fees reform. The second thing we do is I personally maintain our online fines and fees reform library. It's called The Clearinghouse on our website. I can put a link in the chat right after this, just sort of to track all of the different efforts across litigation, legislation, court rule changes, media that highlights the issue, all sorts of things that we consider effective. And the third thing we do is we have state lobbying campaigns to abolish fees and reform fines. Right now we're working on New York and Florida. So if you live in either of those states, I probably would also be able to put you in contact with our team directors.
And actually, just to follow up on something you just said, that I realized we didn't clarify something that I think is really, really, really important. We both talked about it like very briefly, but if as you engage with this issue, people you talk to may ask you like, what's the solution? What's the answer here? And I think I just wanted to sort of re-emphasize what John just said, which is you don't need fees. Nobody's collecting any real money from fees. There's massive bipartisan consensus on getting rid of fees. Some of the most conservative think tanks in the country agree with the ACLU and with us that you should be getting rid of fees entirely. Grover Norquist, who's a very famous anti-tax advocate, even Grover Norquist, who thinks that taxes are the devil, feels that taxes are appropriate and should be used to pay for the criminal legal system. Even he doesn't think that ordinary people should be subsidizing the cost of the legal system in this way. So basically pretty much everybody in the world agrees we should get rid of fees, and the only hurdles are getting it done and convincing state actors to do it, and maybe some presidential candidates to talk about it. With regard to fines, though, fines play kind of an important role, which is that when you remove an alternative to incarceration, you are making incarceration more likely. Many uses of the criminal legal system are completely inappropriate, and people shouldn't be getting arrested in the first place for like bike bell violations, but also for like many crimes that arise from addiction or mental illness or youth or poverty. But when you do have somebody in the system, it's important to have the option of something other than jail or other than community service, or it's important to have the maximum number of non-incarceratory options available, which is why we don't talk about abolishing fines. We just talk about making them subject to actual examinations of a person's ability to pay. Not a pretend one where the court is like, you're indigent, but you can pay for your public defender. Like a real one where if somebody cannot pay, they are not made to pay. So if somebody asks you what the solution is, it's abolishing fees and waivers for people who can't pay their fines. Did I miss anything, John? Ashley, is there anything you would want to add to that?
I agree with the bulk of that. I guess I would say firmly as well, you touched on this before, but we do not support imposing fines in addition to incarceration.
Yeah, that's absolutely co-signed.
Especially because, many of you may know, you can't really make much money while you're incarcerated. And in many states, interest accrues while you're incarcerated on the fine that was imposed against you at sentencing.
Okay, so I think we're going to talk about volunteer assignments and take some questions.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much, Emily, John, and Ashley, for everything so far. It's been a really, really exciting conversation. And just to continue a little bit more, I'm Molly again from Justice Volunteers, about ways to sort of get involved and make changes. Emily and John talked about the work that they're doing. And another really direct part of that is all of you, which is Justice Volunteers and this project that we've already been working to build. And after this webinar, we wanted to make sure that there was a way to really apply sort of a desire to work and learn more about these issues directly. So we actually have a project set up that we'd love to ask you to join us in. After talking to our panelists, it's become clear that there's actually quite little information about how fines and fees are assessed throughout the state of Massachusetts, where they're applied, what the consequences are when people are unable to pay them. And as we've learned so far in this webinar, knowing the information about these fines and fees is really critical to understanding how to change policy and how they affect people in their real lives. So I'd like to just take a second to ask if you, and we'll have a poll that'll come up actually right on your screen, which is pretty exciting, if you would be interested in joining us in this project on Massachusetts. So this is the first question in your poll. It's going to ask you, are you able to help with this fines and fees research assignment in Massachusetts? What will happen if you check yes is that we'll follow up with an email to you right after this call. You'll have very detailed instructions and a place to record the research. And so we would be really excited to have you join us in that. So I'll just pause for a couple seconds so that you can take a second to fill that out. And if your answer is not yes, exclamation point, which we hope it is, you can also check not right now, which is fine because we actually have research projects both related to these issues of criminalizing poverty and really lots of important issues related to the criminal justice system and reform that go on all the time. So for those of you that aren't quite familiar with what we do at Justice Volunteers, we have sort of two main purposes. One of them is to do the research, to collect all this information that really helps to fuel both the Justice Collaborative's work and moving the needle on a lot of these really important issues. So our research team does projects all the time that span lots of different issues, and it's designed to be as flexible as possible. So you can jump in anytime, you can do it from anywhere. There's no sort of weekly commitment or anything like that. All you need is an internet connection and a device to log some information in a spreadsheet and do some online research. So that's what our research team does. And then we also have what we call a media amplification team, which is a team that helps to use social media and other platforms to take articles or messages that are really important to sort of blasting out a perception and understanding of what's going on around some of these issues all over the country, and making sure that those messages are heard in our own communities and then across the country as well. So that's our media amplification team. So we'd love in this quick poll also for you, if you can, to check if you're interested in joining our research team and or our media amplification team or ever lots of other projects that we have going on. Again, by checking this, you'll just receive more information about how to get involved in that, which is really exciting. So thank you so much for that, and we'll be following up with you again after that. We've had some really great questions coming through the different chats as well. So I'll hand it over now to Kelly to go through some of those and start our question and answer while we still have our amazing panelists on.
Yes, and so I wanted to say thank you again to our panelists for taking the time and sharing about your amazing work and some unamazing experiences, because that's the reality of the system. And so one of the first questions we have comes from Hayward Wilson. And his question is, who has the power to simply stop fines and fees?
That's a great question. I'm going to kick off with the typical lawyer answer of it depends.
It depends.
It depends on what you're talking. It would be awesome if there was like a fines and fees czar who could just be like, you know what, we're done with this. But that's not the case. The Constitution specifically reserves criminal law to the states. And that means that every state has a different structure for fines and fees. And what's worse is that within those 50 states, there's like something like 3,000 counties, and all of them have different structures and different decision makers with regard to fines and fees. However, the people who have the most power to change this are prosecutors, local prosecutors and state attorney generals who can decide not to ask for fines or fees, or who can decide to change the way they prosecute a case in response to someone's ability to pay. State legislatures who can change the state law. Oftentimes, court clerks have a weird amount of power about this, but we would be hesitant to realize it's better to change the law than to just get the court clerk to stop imposing Byzantine and impossible practices on suffering people. And I think going to state legislatures, including the governors in that. I do think there's also a role for presidential candidates, though. there's a lot more that federal legislation could be doing to change the way state systems work. I think there's a role for the Commerce Clause on any criminal legal issue in which money is changing hands. I think a broad interpretation of the Commerce Clause could allow for federal legislation to make a change. And also federal legislation can use carrots and sticks, grants and enforcement mechanisms to try to get states to comply with reforms. And I think also a president or a presidential candidate could exhibit leadership by affirmatively talking about the criminalization of poverty and talking about the way in which our justice system is drastically unfair towards people of color and people without the means to pay.
Great. Sorry, go ahead.
Okay, so I'm an organizer at heart, and while I do agree with Emily, I want to also add that people have the power. And anytime we educate people and organize around a thing, and we push it, and we build real grassroots power around it, like we have the power to change that. As long as we keep pushing these conversations, we keep showing up to lobby days, we keep showing up to push our legislators and our attorney generals, and we let them know that this is what we want, and if we don't get it, we will vote you out, literally. Like, we have the power to do that. So just as an organizer, I wanted to just add that as well.
I love that so much, and I want to endorse all of that. So yes, and thank you so much for adding that. You who are listening to this call have the power and have the ability to educate others on these issues.
Emily, what you were saying about presidential candidates kind of segues into another question we had, which are there any current presidential candidates that are major advocates for reform in the criminal justice system? And I don't know if you can actually answer that specifically, but could you possibly weigh in on, you know, what kind of influence they have and how the people can kind of get them to exercise that power?
I'm actually going to give a different answer now that I heard Ashley's last answer. I'm going to be inspired by what Ashley just added to this conversation. So I think the answer is it's really early, right? Kamala Harris and Amy Klobuchar used to be prosecutors and are having to talk more about criminal law than the others because they're having to talk about why they engaged in, I don't want to hit too hard the Democrats, but they're having to talk about their histories with regards to locking people up. And I think Cory Booker comes from a genuine place of having a true interest in the issue. And so he seems to engage on a deeper level with these issues. However, I think all of the frontrunner campaigns, Biden, Bernie, Warren, in the latest Iowa poll, Pete Buttigieg, I think they're all percolating on the issue and they're all sort of developing and refining policy right now. And I think we're going to see a cascade of policy coming out. We've already seen like the beginnings of it. A lot of it right now is focused on stuff that's pretty low impact in terms of decarceration, like closing private prisons. That's awesome. That's like 8% of the prison system. That's not really going to make a big dent. Or, you know, decarceration for people convicted of drug crime. Again, amazing. But when you look at the whole pie, like that's a very small piece of the pie. And we have to really talk about fundamentally rethinking what we use the criminal legal system for. So that is all to say, they will talk about what people demand to hear about. And as Ashley said, like the power is absolutely in the hands of people right now. There's like 20 campaigns scrambling for everybody's attention, like begging you to love them. So if they want your love, you have to make it clear to them that you want to talk about criminal justice, not just in a like, criminal justice is broken and we need to fix it way, but in a like, no, let's get down to the issues. Let's talk about economic justice. Let's talk about fines and fees. Let's talk about voting rights. Let's talk about the specific issues that these candidates need to be informed about. The only way you're gonna force presidents to get informed about an issue they tend to conceive of as a state issue is with massive public demand, grassroots organizing, questions at forums, questions on TV, letters to everyone, tweeting about it, tweet at the candidates. As I said before, I think there's a lot they'd be able to do from office. I think there's a lot, not just in terms of public leadership, but they are controlling the conversation right now. You know, if Joe Biden or Bernie Sanders or Elizabeth Warren says something about one of these issues, especially if they say it in a way that is very specific and draws on the experience of impacted people, that changes the national conversation. So all we'd really like is them to step up right now.
That is great. And I think this might be our last question, but I think it's important to get to. So it asks about distinguishing between, debt from the debtor's prison context and then debt where there's a willful failure to pay fines and fees. And I just want you guys to weigh in on whether or not you think that's a legitimate distinction or one we should be making when we talk about reform work.
I can take this one. So that's what Emily was talking about before. Under the case law in Bearden v. Georgia, there can only be sanctions for non-payment if the non-payment was willful, which basically means that the person had the ability to pay but chose not to. The issue comes in how that determination is made. Under the Constitution, judges are supposed to hold a formal hearing where they determine ability to pay, but the Supreme Court decision doesn't lay out specifics. We have on our clearinghouse what we think are good model ability to pay determinations. Like if someone's receiving public assistance, like they probably can't pay. There are a bunch of different criteria that different states are using, and we have there are bench cards, sort of like guides for judges that jurisdictions will issue to say okay, if this person makes this percent of the poverty line or has X amount of income, then they can't actually pay it. And that's the formal distinction. But the issue comes in where judges are saying oh, well, you just got a manicure or you have an iPhone, therefore you can pay. And it gets into this really gross cultural shaming that happens on a person-to-person basis. And I think that's part of the whole debtor's prison complex too, particularly in jurisdictions where there hasn't been extensive legislative or court reform.
Sorry, and I'll just say this. I just wanted to talk about the concept of people willfully not paying or people willfully getting themselves in debt, getting their license suspended, driving without a license, and then going to jail. People are not willfully doing that. People are literally choosing between gas and electric or this bill, or their children's school clothes or this bill, or dinner tonight or this bill. Literally, when we think about what economic justice looks like, I also just want to also keep us really towing that line of the language that we use, because poor people are not just willfully not paying debt. It's not being paid because literally people can't afford to pay it. Literally, it's I'm going to buy dinner or I'm going to pay this ticket. So I just wanted to say that I feel a responsibility to always bring that stuff to light when we use that type of language. So
yeah, I want to draw a distinction between the way things actually are and the way things should be. When we talk about willful failure to pay, what's actually happening in real life in courts every day is that people who are choosing to buy medicine for their kid instead of paying a traffic ticket are being told that that is a willful failure to pay, and they are being thrown in jail because of it. And this is grotesque, and it is our reality, and it has to be changed. When we talk about policy and the way things should be, we do want to build in a world in which if Bill Gates refuses to pay his traffic ticket, Bill Gates should have some sort of consequence. But that's what we mean about real indigency determinations, right? That really take into account people's capacity and don't just make blanket rulings because this judge hates people and this judge is nice, and we want to eradicate the unfairness of poor people having to make these choices and being told the choices are willful, when in fact the choices are the choices any of us would make because they are the necessary things we do to survive.
I'm just going to put a resource in chat that might help people get more details if they're interested.
Perfect. Well, thank you all. And that kind of wraps up our first webinar for our Blueprint series. And I think it was amazing. So thank you again to John, Emily, and Ashley for spending time with us. And thank you to our justice volunteers for all the great work that you do. So this webinar has been recorded, and we will be sending out a recording of that for you and to share with your networks. And we'll also be following up with a short survey so we can get some feedback. And if after you're thinking about this later on. If you have any questions about the Justice Volunteers or about fines and fees, you can, include that in the survey, and we will absolutely get back to you. And then the very last thing is to keep an eye out for the next installment of our Blueprint series, which will talk about juvenile justice reform. And so the poll that Molly had up a little while ago also asked about whether or not you'd be interested in joining that. And so we would love to have you back for that, and we will follow up with more information. So thank you all very much, and enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Bye.